So that's what we look at when we look at archaeology. And we're going to look at some specific examples. And I'm actually going to give you a little kind of background as to how archaeology was created, or developed, I should say. But beforehand, let's jump to Daniel chapter 5. And if you remember, this is Daniel in his older years. Now, Israel has been captive under the thumb of Babylon for nearly 70 years. And Daniel's an old man now. He started off as a 17-year-old kid, so he's pushing 80 or 90. And he knows that the time is almost up. But Nebuchadnezzar, who was the conquering king of Babylon, took the Egyptians captive. He's long gone. It's his grandson that's on the throne right now, Belshazzar. And it says here, King Belshazzar held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine in their presence. Under the influence of the wine, Belshazzar gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels that his predecessor, his father, it may say in your translation, Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, wives, and concubines could drink from them. So they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, wives, and concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised their gods made of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. At that moment, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the king's palace wall next to the lampstand. As the king watched the hand that was writing, his face turned pale, and his thoughts so terrified him that his hip joints shook and his knees knocked together. This is one of the times where I actually prefer the King James, because the King James here reads, and his knees smote one against the other. And I just think that's the most perfect translation. The king called out to bring in the mediums, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. He said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this inscription and gives me its interpretation will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain around his neck, and have the third highest position in the kingdom. So all the king's wise men came in, but none could read the inscription or make its interpretation known to him. Then King Belshazzar became even more terrified. His face turned pale, and his nobles were bewildered. The queen comes in, I'm going to skip some of this, and says, hey, son, hey, I don't know if it's a son or grandson, we're not quite sure. The queen mother basically comes in and says, you know, your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had a guy who knew his stuff when all these tough questions came up. His name's Daniel. He's the guy that you need to call. Forget all these clowns. So jump down to verse 13. Then Daniel was brought before the king. The king said to him, are you, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles that my predecessor, the king, brought from Judah? I've heard that you have the spirit of the gods in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and extraordinary wisdom. Now the wise men and the mediums were brought before me to read this inscription and to make its interpretation known to me, but they could not give me this interpretation. However, I have heard about you that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Therefore, if you can read this inscription and give me its interpretation, you'll be clothed in purple, have a gold chain around your neck, and have the third highest position in the kingdom. Now, Daniel does something interesting here that if you compare to the rest of the book, you'll catch what's going on. In the rest of the book, it's always, "O king, live forever." In ancient cultures, there's this pomp and circumstance that always meets a dignitary. Well, Daniel knows something that this guy doesn't know. First of all, he doesn't care about this kid at all, because this kid has treated his God with contempt. He's been flippant, partying with the temple cups and things like that. But Daniel also knows what the writing on the wall means. So you'll notice that right here, Daniel doesn't do the "O king, live forever, may your servant humbly serve you," all that kind of stuff. He just says, look, I'm too old for all that stuff. I'm sorry. Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts and give your reward to someone else. However, I will read the inscription for your king and make the interpretation known to him. Your majesty, the most high God, gave sovereignty, greatness, glory, and majesty to your predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar. Because of the greatness he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages were terrified and fearful of him. He killed anyone he wanted and kept alive anyone he wanted. He exalted anyone he wanted and humbled anyone he wanted, but when his heart was exalted and his spirit became arrogant, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken from him. He's driven away from his people. His mind was like an animal's. He's recounting all of this stuff that happened in Daniel chapter 4, actually. And he was fed grass like the cattle. But you, his successor, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. Instead, you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. The vessels of his house were brought to you, as you and your nobles, wives, and concubines drank from them. You praised the gods made of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which you did not see, hear, or understand. But you have not glorified the God who holds your life breath in your hand. And then he goes on to say this, the inscription, many, many, tekel upharsin, numbered, weighed, and divided. Your days are numbered. You've been weighed and found wanting. And this day the kingdom will be taken from you, is the short version. And the king says, wow, that's right. You're amazing. And he goes on to anoint Daniel a third ruler of the kingdom. So, just in this chapter alone, we get some interesting pieces here. First of all, Belshazzar was ruler over Babylon. That's a claim that may be able to be checked historically. Did this guy really exist? Did he live? He was a son, a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon was to be conquered in one night. This night, the kingdom is taken from you. Right? Daniel says, right now, your time. I think this is why he wasn't too worried. What's he going to do to me? You know, will your boss fire you his last day on the job? I don't know. Darius the Mede would receive the kingdom, and Daniel was promised to be a third ruler over the kingdom. Now that third ruler thing is kind of strange, isn't it? You know, why would it be the third ruler as opposed to something else? Those are the kind of puzzles that make Christian scholars and archaeologists go, I need to check these things out. Well, how do we do this kind of stuff? Well, a lot of it involves digging in the ground, trying to find things. Most people don't realize that archaeology is not an old science. It's actually a fairly new field of study. It really didn't even begin to be thought about in any systematic way until maybe 150 years ago, maybe 200 years ago. There was in the late Enlightenment period, so 1799, 1800s, that kind of early 1800s, there was a very big movement, what they called Neoclassicism. And if you go to Europe today, you'll see a lot of, matter of fact, even if you go to Washington, D.C., you can see this. All the Greek columns have been reproduced for all of our, government buildings and stuff like that, because the thought in the Enlightenment was that those guys had the perfect society, the beauty of the Roman Republic and the Greek democracy of Athens, or the thinking, So there was a push to try and get back to that classical idea. As a result, in any fad, what happens is people want to start buying the stuff that help show that they're hip. And so how do you help show that you're hip when you dig Greek and Roman stuff? Well, if you have a lot of money, you hire people to go to Greece and Rome and find any statue or artifact that they can. You bring it back to your house, right? That's what you do. And this was what was going on. It was when Napoleon conquered the world that he started pulling some of these things out. Matter of fact, specifically in Egypt. He invaded Egypt in 1798. And he did something that was unique. He not only wanted to grab Egyptian artifacts and understand them, but he took surveyors and draftsmen to start actually plotting where these things were. Before that, people would just dig it up, make a quick buck, and move on. So he started selling some of these things and cataloging Egyptian monuments. Some soldiers found a stone, some folks from Napoleon's army, in an area of the Nile called Rosetta. And it was a stone that had interesting writing on it. There's 3 sections, if you've ever seen this stone. And one of which is the standard Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, Egyptian hieroglyphics, nobody knew what to make of them in Napoleon's day. Okay, they knew that these symbols were all over. They didn't know if they were graffiti. They didn't know if they were pure hieroglyphics. They didn't quite know what to do with them, but nobody could read anything. There was a second layer that had kind of alphabetic characters, but it wasn't any alphabet of European descent. But the third line, the third section, was in Greek. So you could read the Greek. Now, Jean-Francois Champollion worked arduously for years to try and see if he could understand this stone. See, because that middle section they found out was what they called Demotic Egyptian. Demotic Egyptian was an Egyptian language, an old Egyptian language, ancient Egyptian language, but it used alphabets and not symbols. Okay, so here you have something in Greek, and Champollion starts to learn Coptic in order to read Demotic, which is, the forebearer of Coptic. So he gets the Greek. We can all read the Greek. That's fine. He starts to figure out the Coptic Egyptian, and that becomes a bridge to reading the hieroglyphic Egyptian. Now, it's not until this was found in, I think, 1798. It's not until maybe the 1870s. So it's almost 100 years, 80 to 100 years before the Rosetta Stone really completely was decrypted and Egyptian hieroglyphics was opened up, and now everybody could read what was going on in ancient Egypt. But that's what we see. Those finds begin to spur other people. All of a sudden, new civilizations are opened up, and people start saying, wow, these guys had things that we didn't even realize how sophisticated their cultures were. And other people start to understand them. At the same time, cuneiform writing becomes decoded. And in the mid to late 1800s, and thousands of these clay tablets that have been dug up can now be read, and we can understand what was going on in the Middle East areas of life. Bills of sale, statutes from the king, all kinds of things. And so they start to say, wow, we know, look, it's exciting to find out about all these empires. How do we find out more? Well, the only way to do it is to refine this process and start digging up what you've known. Now, again, the first thing was happenstance. They would try to dig up the big stuff, and they throw all of the garbage aside. But then they started going, we got to be a little bit more systematic about this. So they would go to a place where they think there was a civilization, and they'd make everything into a grid. And even today, you will see that they'll put these strings up, and they'll make everything into a grid. And then that helps them catalog. If you find something, you find it in, section D1. It's like playing Battleship or something. You can put every point into every section. That way you can recreate a city map with each person simply working on one grid. You can have another guy come together, take it all, and recreate the entire city in some place, that's less hot than the Egyptian desert or something like that. So that starts to happening. And then somebody, and I can't remember, I'm sorry I can't remember the archaeologist's name, I didn't note it down. Somebody started going, we've been throwing away all of this broken pottery because we just thought that those were the remnants of what had happened when people ran over. We've been looking for the statues. The pottery is going to tell us more about life than anything else because pottery is ubiquitous. In other words, today, let's go to the last 10 years. Here's a good example. If you reach into your pocket now, chances are you'll pull out a smartphone. Okay? You'll pull out a phone that's able to receive text messages, that's able to take photos, that's able to go online. Just 10 years ago, the chances of you pulling out a smartphone are pretty much nil. You'd pull out a flip phone, right? I loved the flip phones. I waited 30 years for the flip phones just so I could say, there's no intelligent life here, Scotty, beam me up. That was all and hey, it worked. If you go 10 years before that, there's no phones at all. So you can, by knowing which phone is in somebody's pocket, pretty much put them at a certain point in time, right? Pottery works the same way. Everybody used pottery, and all potteries had different styles over the years. So what these archaeologists started to figure out is, this is our timeline. We could start piecing together broken pottery, and once we put it back together, we can tell what time this layer that we're digging in is from. And that's what they started doing. Pottery, luckily, is extremely durable. It gets ignored, and pottery breaks even for old folks, folks in the old days. So it's really easy to get or really easy to be left behind if you're running from an invading army or something like that. A lot of times they'll leave the broken pottery behind, and then the next guy comes, burns the city down. It all gets covered up, and it's waiting for the archaeologist's spade. So that's kind of what really advances archaeology in putting together these timelines and understanding where things fall. Now, obviously, the deeper you dig, the earlier you go, right? Because cities tend to be built on top of each other. So one of the things that you have to do is you have to preserve those layers in some way. And what archaeologists do, if you look at their grids, they don't dig to the corners of the grids. They leave a 1 meter piece of ground that goes all the way from today, the top of the hill, down to wherever they're excavating. And so every square has these pathways to them. Those pathways are called bulks. And they help you to come back. If somebody questions you, you can come back and look at the bulk, and you can see the strata right at the site and make them. Now, I asked an archaeologist once, what happens if you got the bulk? What happens if in there's like this beautiful ornate cup? Do you take it out? And he says there's actually a really big fight about that within archaeology, because is it something so important, maybe an inscription of a battle, that we would need it, but doesn't preserving it in the strata itself tell us something? And if we start taking everything out of the bulks, then we're going to lose that record. See, that's the thing. Archaeology is a one-shot process. You can only dig this stuff out one time. So if you make a mistake or don't record it or record it wrong, you've got bad information. Now, the reason why all of this works, and you don't have to dig quite everywhere, is how a tell is formed. Now, a tell is a hill that archaeologists are normally digging on. Okay, if you see, and you go to Israel today, you'll see hills. Some of them are mountainsides, and you can tell that. But there's usually, a lot of times, you look on kind of near a plain, and then all of a sudden there's this kind of hill that comes in and drops out. Archaeologists will immediately tell you that that's a tell, and that means that there's probably been several civilizations living in that spot. The way you check this stuff out is, first of all, you look for a place that would probably be good for a city. Now, cities tend to be built a little bit higher than the rest of the surrounding land because you want to see enemies coming. You want to be able to wall it off. You also want to have water. You want to make sure that water is available, so a running stream or a river or something like that fairly close to a mound would be a really good sign that there's probably been civilization there. I mean, they had to carry this stuff by hand. They didn't want to go too far. And if there's ability for farming, if the lower lying areas aren't all rocks, but they're, maybe some farming areas, that's also a good sign, because then the surrounding communities could go out to farm, but they could come into the city and close up the walls if an invader's showing up. So somebody would find this area, and they say, this is a good place to, start a camp. They start building a city. Well, inevitably, they'd start to create buildings. And most buildings in those days weren't built, say, completely of stone. This is another kind of thing. You see these ruins, and you see that all the ruins are kind of like this high, and you go, wow, they knocked those walls down. Well, that's not quite the way it works. Stone was heavy, and especially in the Middle East. There's plenty of it, so it's not like they didn't have to use it, but they wouldn't build a lot of things fully with stone. You'd have to have a lot of money because it's hard to work with. They would build a foundation of stone. That would be their foundation. And then they would create either adobe brick or mud or something like that, build up the walls, and they would maybe have a roof top that's supported by timbers. So that because of that, when an invading army would come in and they'd chase the guys out, if they'd knock down the walls because it was all mud and stuff like that, or adobe, it was easier to knock down, or they'd set fire to the town and the timbers would burn up, and all you would have would be these structures, these foundational structures that were filled in with kind of the rubble. Well, wind, rain, you get a little sediment, it starts to smooth itself over again, and then another guy comes and says, hey, that looks like a good place for a city, and the whole process starts over again. So you get civilization on top of civilization on top of civilization. And it's interesting, when I was in Rome last year, and I started asking them about about this because it's tough. In Greece and Rome, it's like everywhere you dig, it's an archaeological find. You just can't escape it. And they were having a real big problem because they said, look, statues we got, we need a subway. It's like, we just want the subway. Ruins, Roman ruins, we got them, no problem. We just want to dig a subway. Can we just please just do that? But it's a struggle that they have there. And the other struggle that the archaeologist has is, by the way, where do you stop? Okay, suppose you're an archaeologist in Israel. You're digging, oh, here it is. Nehemiah's returned from exile, right? Here's the city. That's great. But we'd have to destroy Nehemiah's city to go down to David's city. We have to destroy David's city to get down to the time of Joshua. You see the problem? What do you do? Sometimes you pick sections and you go deeper in different sections so you can, and again, you try to catalog everything. So I tell you all this because you have to understand the struggles the archaeologist has and the partial picture he gets. You never get a clear snapshot of everything that's going on in a city. You always have partial areas. You don't know how far the city extended unless you found the walls perhaps against it. You don't know how far down to go. You don't know how many civilizations might be there, might not be there. It becomes quite a struggle. So that's what a tell does. As these cities get built up, the archaeologist comes in and starts removing the layers, trying to understand more and more and more. But because of the inherent limitations of the process, and you got to try and figure it all out too. You got to try and figure, okay, I mean, houses are just, or buildings, I should say, are just, here's 2 rooms out of stone. Well, okay, what was this building? Was this a home? Was this a business? Was this a home and a business? Was it a brothel? Was it a inn? How do we tell some of these things with nothing but 1.5 feet of stacked stones? It becomes difficult. You look at coins and you look at pottery and seeing what kinds of things that they used. If you find grain, it might be a granary. Okay, this might be where they stored food, things like that.